Back in the 1960s, American grandmothers baked 30 heirloom cakes that families believed would be passed down forever. These cakes appeared at church potlucks and birthday celebrations across the country. Then, something happened. The recipes stopped being taught. The grandmothers who knew them passed away, and entire family traditions vanished with them. Today, most Americans have never even heard of these cakes. Let's rediscover these 30 forgotten heirloom cakes. From the 1960s, no one passes down anymore. Every grandmother in the 1960s had her own version of hot milk cake written on a stained index card. The recipe was deceptively simple. Just eggs, sugar, flour, baking powder, vanilla, and scalding hot milk stirred in at the very end. The hot milk created a tender, moist crumb that stayed fresh for days. Grandmothers baked this cake in rectangular pans 9 by 13 inches and served it plain with a dusting of powdered sugar or frosted with simple buttercream. The cake appeared at every birthday party, church potluck, and Sunday dinner throughout the decade. What made it special was the technique. The milk had to be heated until bubbles formed around the edges, then poured into the batter while still steaming hot. Mothers learned by standing beside their grandmothers, watching the exact moment to add the milk. By the 1990s, box mixes replaced scratch baking, and daughters never learned the hot milk technique. The heirloom cake that once fed every celebration disappeared from family kitchens. Walking into a grandmother's kitchen in 1962, you'd find buttermilk cake baking in the oven at least once a week. This simple vanilla cake used cultured buttermilk to create an incredibly tender texture and subtle tang that made it unforgettable. Grandmothers creamed butter and sugar by hand until fluffy, added eggs one at a time, then alternated flour and buttermilk until smooth. The batter went into greased tube pans or layer pans and baked at 350 Fahrenheit until golden. The cake was served plain, dusted with powdered sugar, or frosted with cream cheese icing. Families ate it for breakfast with coffee, dessert after dinner, and snacks throughout the day. The recipe required real buttermilk, not the milk and vinegar substitute, and room temperature. Ingredients mixed in a specific order. Mothers learned by measuring ingredients while their mothers mixed, understanding that cold butter wouldn't cream properly and overmixing made the cake tough. By the 2000s, buttermilk disappeared from most refrigerators, and daughters never learned why it mattered. The heirloom cake that once appeared weekly vanished from modern baking. Birthday celebrations in the 1960s always featured Lazy Daisy oatmeal cake with its signature broiled coconut topping. Grandmothers started by pouring boiling water over quick-cooking oats and letting them sit until softened and cooled. Meanwhile, they creamed butter and both white and brown sugar, added eggs and vanilla, then mixed in the cooled oatmeal along with flour, baking soda, cinnamon, and nutmeg. The batter is baked in a 9 by 13 pan for 35 minutes. While the cake was still hot from the oven, grandmothers spread a mixture of melted butter, brown sugar, coconut cream, and vanilla over the top, then slid it under the broiler for 2 to 3 minutes until golden and bubbly. The topping caramelized into a crispy, chewy layer that contrasted perfectly with the tender spiced cake underneath. The name Lazy Daisy came from how easy it was to make, just one pan. No fancy decorating, no layers to stack. Mothers learned by watching their mothers broil the topping without burning it. By the 1990s, coconut fell out of favor, and daughters never tasted this beloved cake. Before we continue, many of you have been asking where to find these recipes. We've gathered hundreds of them from the Depression era through the 1970s in our cookbook, Grandma's Kitchen. Complete instructions, pro tips in 10 chapters. Link is in the description below. Now, let's get back to the video. Overripe bananas in the 1960s never went to waste in grandmother's kitchen. They became banana cake with cream cheese frosting. Grandmothers mashed very ripe bananas with a fork until smooth, then mixed them with softened butter, sugar, eggs, buttermilk, and vanilla. Flour, baking soda, baking powder, and salt went in last, mixed just until combined to keep the cake tender. The batter baked in 2 round layer pans at 350 Fahrenheit for 25–30 minutes. While the layers cooled, grandmothers made cream cheese frosting by beating softened cream cheese with butter, powdered sugar, and vanilla until fluffy. The frosted cake sat in the refrigerator overnight, allowing the flavors to develop and the frosting to firm up. This wasn't banana bread. It was a proper layer cake, moist and tender with intense banana flavor. The recipe required bananas so ripe they were almost black, something modern cooks throw away. Mothers learned by helping mash bananas and knowing when they were ripe enough. By the 2000s, banana bread replaced banana cake, and the layered version disappeared from family tables. Southern grandmothers in the 1960s made Italian cream cheesecake. For every special occasion, despite its misleading name, it wasn't Italian at all. The recipe combined softened cream cheese, butter, and sugar, creamed until light and fluffy. Egg yolks went in one at a time, followed by buttermilk mixed with baking soda, flour, vanilla, shredded coconut, and chopped pecans. Stiffly beaten egg whites were folded in last, creating an incredibly light texture. The batter was divided between 3 round pans and baked at 350 Fahrenheit for 25 minutes. The cream cheese frosting contained softened cream cheese, butter, powdered sugar, and vanilla, spread between layers and over the entire cake, then covered with more coconut and pecans. The finished cake was tall, impressive, and rich without being heavy. Families served this at weddings, anniversaries, Christmas dinners, and Easter celebrations. The technique of folding in egg whites properly required practice. Deflating them made the cake dense instead of airy. Mothers learned by watching their mothers fold gently with a rubber spatula. By the 1990s, bakery cakes replaced homemade, and daughters never learned this Southern classic. 5 cakes disappeared from family kitchens. 25 more followed the same path. Grandmothers stopped baking from scratch. Recipe cards were thrown away during moves. Box mixes replaced handwritten recipes. Daughters never learned the techniques. The teaching stopped. The baking ended. The cakes died with the generation that made them. Saturday mornings in the 1960s meant sour cream coffee cake baking in grandmother's oven. This wasn't breakfast. It was an all-day cake served with coffee to visitors, neighbors, and family who stopped by. Grandmothers creamed butter and sugar, added eggs and vanilla, then alternated flour mixed with baking powder and baking soda with full-fat sour cream. Half the batter went into a greased tube pan, followed by a layer of cinnamon sugar pecan streusel, then the remaining batter, and finally more streusel on top. The cake baked at 350 Fahrenheit for 50-60 minutes until a toothpick came out clean. After cooling, grandmothers dusted it with powdered sugar or drizzled it with a simple glaze. The cake stayed moist for days thanks to the sour cream, and the streusel created pockets of cinnamon sweetness throughout. Families ate thick slices with their morning coffee and afternoon tea. The key was not skimping on the streusel. It needed to be generous and crumbly, not sparse. Mothers learned by making the streusel while their mothers mixed the batter. By the 2000s, store-bought coffee cakes replaced homemade, and the sour cream version vanished. Company dinners in the 1960s always ended with lemon chiffon cake, served on grandmother's best cake stand. This wasn't a heavy cake. It was light, airy, and delicate, made with vegetable oil instead of butter. Grandmother separated eggs carefully, making sure no yolk got into the whites. They mixed flour, sugar, baking powder, and salt, then added oil, egg yolks, water, lemon juice, and lemon zest. In a separate bowl, they beat egg whites with cream of tartar until stiff peaks formed, then folded them gently into the batter. The mixture went into an ungreased tube pan and baked at 325 Fahrenheit for over an hour. The cake had to cool completely upside down, suspended on a bottleneck to prevent collapsing. Once cool, grandmothers ran a knife around the edges to release it. They served it plain, dusted with powdered sugar, or with fresh lemon glaze. The texture was somewhere between angel food and sponge cake, incredibly tender and moist. Folding egg whites without deflating them was an art mothers learned through practice. By the 1990s, chiffon cakes disappeared, considered too much work, and daughters never learned the upside-down cooling technique. Holiday gatherings in the 1960s featured orange chiffon cake as the centerpiece dessert on grandmother's dining table. Like its lemon cousin, this cake used vegetable oil and beaten egg whites to create an impossibly light texture. Grandmothers mixed flour, sugar, baking powder, and salt in one bowl. In another, they combined oil, egg yolks, fresh orange juice, orange zest, and vanilla. The wet ingredients went into the dry, mixed until smooth. Separately, Egg whites and cream of tartar were beaten until stiff but not dry, then carefully folded into the orange batter. The mixture baked in an ungreased tube pan at 325 Fahrenheit for about 55 minutes. After baking, the pan was immediately inverted and left to cool completely upside down. This step was crucial to prevent the cake from falling. Once cool, grandmothers frosted it with orange buttercream or simple orange glaze made with powdered sugar and orange juice. The cake was delicate, fragrant, and melted on the tongue. The technique of properly folding egg whites determined success or failure. Mothers learned by observing their mother's gentle folding motion. By the 2000s, chiffon cakes were forgotten, and daughters never experienced this ethereal texture. Sunday dinners in the 1960s concluded with brown sugar pound cake, drizzled with grandmother's famous praline icing. This wasn't ordinary pound cake. The brown sugar gave it deep caramel flavor and golden color. Grandmothers creamed 1 pound of butter with both white and brown sugar for a full 5 minutes until light and fluffy. 5 eggs went in one at a time, each beaten thoroughly before adding the next. Flour, baking powder, and salt were sifted together, then added alternately with milk and vanilla. The thick batter was spooned into a greased and floured tube pan and baked at 325 Fahrenheit for 80–90 minutes. While the cake cooled, grandmothers made praline icing by melting butter with brown sugar and cream, boiling it briefly, then beating in powdered sugar until smooth. The icing was poured over the warm cake, where it hardened into a sweet, nutty glaze. The cake was dense, buttery, and rich, true pound cake texture. Creaming the butter and sugar long enough was critical for proper texture. Mothers learned by timing their mother's mixing and knowing when the batter looked right. By the 1990s, people stopped making pound cakes from scratch, and this brown sugar version disappeared completely. Christmas mornings in the 1960s started with pecan pound cake from grandmother's recipe box, a tradition passed down through 3 generations. This cake combined the richness of classic pound cake with the crunch of toasted pecans throughout. Grandmothers chopped pecans finely, tossed them with a little flour to prevent sinking, then set them aside. They creamed butter and sugar until almost white, added eggs one by one, then incorporated flour, baking powder, salt, milk, and vanilla. The floured pecans were folded in gently at the end. The batter went into a greased tube pan and baked at 325 Fahrenheit for over an hour until golden, pulling away from the sides. The cake cooled in the pan for 15 minutes before being turned out onto a wire rack. Grandmothers served it plain, letting the buttery richness and nutty flavor shine through. Some dusted it with powdered sugar. Others glazed it with simple sugar syrup. The cake stayed moist for a week when wrapped properly in wax paper and stored in a tin. Toasting the pecans first was grandmother's secret. It intensified their flavor. Mothers learned by toasting nuts while their mothers mixed batter. By the 2000s, store-bought pound cake replaced homemade, and the piquant version was forgotten. 10 cakes disappeared from grandmother's kitchens. 20 more vanished just as quietly. Every recipe was baked from scratch in the 1960s. Every recipe was gone by 2000. Daughters never asked for the recipes. Grandmothers died without teaching anyone. The ovens went cold. The tradition ended forever. Busy weeknight dinners in the 1960s often ended with pineapple dump cake, the easiest dessert grandmother ever made. The name came from the method. Everything was literally dumped into the pan without mixing. Grandmothers opened 2 cans of crushed pineapple, drained them slightly but not completely, and spread the fruit across the bottom of a 9x13 baking dish. They sprinkled 1 box of yellow cake mix evenly over the pineapple, covering it completely with dry mix. Thin slices of cold butter were placed all over the top of the dry cake mix, covering as much surface as possible. Some grandmothers added chopped pecans or walnuts on top for extra crunch. The dish went into a 350 Fahrenheit oven for 45–50 minutes until the top was golden brown and bubbly. As it baked, the butter melted out down through the dry cake mix, creating a crispy golden crust on top, while the pineapple bubbled up around the edges. The finished cake was served warm with vanilla ice cream or whipped cream. It wasn't fancy, but it was foolproof and delicious. The recipe required no bowls, no mixer, no measuring, just open, dump, bake. Mothers learned by watching their mothers arrange the butter slices evenly across the top. The key was using real butter, not margarine, and not draining the pineapple completely. The juice helped steam the cake mix from below. By the 2000s, homemade dump cakes fell out of favor, replaced by boxed cake mixes baked traditionally, and daughters never learned this effortless technique. Rainy autumn afternoons in the 1960s meant tomato soup cake baking in grandmother's kitchen, filling the house with warm spice aromas. The recipe seemed bizarre to modern tastes. An entire can of Campbell's condensed tomato soup mixed right. Into the cake batter, grandmother's creamed butter and sugar, added eggs, then stirred in one undiluted can of tomato soup. Flour, baking soda, baking powder, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and allspice went in next, along with raisins and chopped walnuts. The thick, rust-colored batter was poured into a greased tube pan or two-layer pans and baked at 350 Fahrenheit for about 40 minutes. The finished cake was incredibly moist, deeply spiced, and tasted nothing like tomatoes. The soup added moisture and a subtle savory undertone that balanced the sweet spices perfectly. Grandmothers frosted it with cream cheese icing, which complemented the spice flavors beautifully. The cake stayed moist for over a week, getting better each day as the flavors melded. Families ate it for dessert, breakfast with coffee, and afternoon snacks. The recipe became popular during World War II when ingredients were scarce, and it remained a beloved oddity through the 1960s. Mothers learned by watching their mothers stir the bright red soup into cake batter without flinching. The key was using the condensed soup, not the diluted version, and not skimping on the spices. By the 1980s, the recipe seemed too strange for modern palates, and daughters never tasted this moist, mysterious spice cake. Summer gatherings in the 1960s featured icebox cake, the no-bake dessert that impressed everyone despite requiring 0 oven time. Grandmothers made this during heat waves when turning on the oven was unbearable. They whipped heavy cream with sugar and vanilla until stiff peaks formed. No shortcuts, no Cool Whip, just real cream beaten by hand or with an electric mixer. Nabisco chocolate wafer cookies were the foundation. Thin, crispy, dark chocolate cookies sold in distinctive yellow boxes. Grandmothers spread a thin layer of whipped cream on each cookie and stacked them sideways, in a long log on a serving platter. The entire log was then covered completely with the remaining whipped cream, smoothed to look like a frosted cake. The whole thing went into the refrigerator overnight, at least 8 hours, preferably 12. During that time, moisture from the whipped cream softened the cookies until they had the texture of cake layers. To serve, grandmothers sliced the log diagonally, revealing beautiful striped layers of chocolate and cream. The dessert was light, refreshing, and perfect for summer. Some grandmothers added a tablespoon of instant coffee to the whipped cream for a mocha version. The technique required patience. Eating it too soon meant crunchy cookies instead of cake-like layers. Mothers learned by helping spread cream on cookies and understanding that overnight refrigeration was non-negotiable. By the 1990s, the specific Nabisco wafers became harder to find, and daughters never learned this elegant no-bake technique. Easter Sunday dinners in the 1960s concluded with coconut chiffon cake, tall and impressive on grandmother's crystal cake stand. This variation on classic chiffon cake incorporated both shredded coconut and coconut extract for intense flavor. Grandmothers toasted sweetened coconut in a dry skillet until golden and fragrant, then let it cool completely. They mixed flour, sugar, baking powder, and salt, then added vegetable oil, egg yolks, coconut milk, coconut extract, and half the toasted coconut. In a spotlessly clean bowl, egg whites were beaten with cream of tartar until stiff peaks formed. Any trace of grease or yolk would prevent proper whipping. The beaten whites were folded carefully into the coconut batter using a rubber spatula, cutting down through the center and folding over gently to maintain airiness. The batter went into an ungreased tube pan and baked at 320 Fahrenheit for about 55 minutes. The cake cooled upside down for at least an hour to prevent collapsing. Once completely cool, grandmothers ran a thin knife around the edges and center tube to release it. They frosted it with 7-minute frosting, a cooked meringue-based frosting made by beating egg whites with sugar syrup over simmering water until glossy peaks formed. The remaining toasted coconut was pressed all over the frosted cake, covering it completely. The finished cake was light, moist, tropical, and spectacular. Making 7-minute frosting required constant beating and careful temperature control. Mothers learned by holding the mixer while their mothers beat the frosting over steam. By the 2000s, chiffon cakes disappeared completely, and this coconut version was forgotten. Saturday morning breakfast in the 1960s always featured crumb cake, still warm from grandmother's oven. This wasn't coffee cake. It was crumb cake, and the difference was significant. The cake layer was simple and plain, serving only as a base for the real star, an impossibly thick layer of buttery, cinnamon sugar crumbs on top. Half the crumb mixture was set aside. The other half was pressed into the bottom of a greased 9x13 pan to form a crust. The cake batter, a simple mixture of butter, sugar, eggs, flour, baking powder, salt, milk, and vanilla, was spread carefully over the crumb crust. The reserved crumbs were scattered generously over the top, creating a thick blanket of buttery topping. The cake baked at 350 Fahrenheit for 35–40 minutes until the crumbs were golden and the cake was set. After cooling slightly, it was cut into squares and served warm with coffee. The ratio of crumbs to cake was crucial. There should be almost as much crumb as cake. Mothers learned by making the crumb mixture while their mothers mixed the batter, understanding that cold butter and a light touch were essential. By the 1990s, boxed coffee cake mixes replaced homemade crumb cake, and daughters never experienced the satisfaction of that thick, buttery crumb layer. 15 cakes vanished from family tables. 15 more disappeared just as completely. Grandmothers stopped baking from scratch. Recipe boxes were thrown in trash during estate sales. Nobody saved them. Nobody wrote them down again. The teaching chain broke. Daughters never learned. The cakes died forever. Autumn harvest celebrations in the 1960s centered around Gran's apple cake, dense with fresh apples and warm spices. Grandmothers peeled and chopped fresh apples, usually tart Granny Smith or crisp winesap varieties, until they had about 4 cups of small pieces. The apples were tossed with cinnamon and a little sugar, then set aside while the batter was prepared. Grandmothers creamed butter and sugar thoroughly, added eggs one at a time, then incorporated flour, baking soda, salt, cinnamon, nutmeg, and vanilla. The chopped apples and chopped pecans or walnuts were folded in last. The batter was thick and heavy, almost more apples than batter. Everything went into a greased 9x13 pan and baked at 350 Fahrenheit for 45 to 50 minutes until golden and firm. While the cake was still warm, grandmothers spread cream cheese frosting over the top. Softened cream cheese beaten with butter, powdered sugar, and vanilla until smooth and fluffy. The frosting melted slightly into the warm cake, creating pockets of creamy sweetness throughout. The cake was incredibly moist, almost pudding-like in texture, and tasted like concentrated apple pie. It needed to be refrigerated because of the cream cheese frosting and stayed fresh for over a week. The key was using fresh, tart apples and chopping them small enough to distribute evenly. Mothers learned by peeling apples alongside their mothers, understanding that sweet apples made the cake too sugary. By the 2000s, apple cake recipes called for cake mix and canned pie filling, and this fresh apple version disappeared from family kitchens. Church potluck suppers in the 1960s always included someone's grandmother's raw apple cake, carried in a covered dish still slightly warm. Despite the name, nothing was raw. It simply meant fresh. Uncooked apples were used instead of cooked apple filling. Grandmothers chopped fresh apples into very small pieces, almost minced, then tossed them with cinnamon and sugar to release their juices. In a separate bowl, they beat eggs with vegetable oil and both white and brown sugar until thick and smooth. Flour, baking soda, salt, cinnamon, nutmeg, and vanilla were stirred in along with the sugared apples and chopped nuts, usually pecans or walnuts. The batter was extremely thick and chunky, barely coating the apples. It was scraped into a greased tube pan or 913 pan and baked at 350 Fahrenheit for about an hour until deeply golden and firm to the touch. The cake came out dense, moist, and packed with apples in every bite. Some grandmothers served it plain with a dusting of powdered sugar. Others made a simple glaze with powdered sugar and apple cider. The cake improved after a day, becoming even moister as the apples released more juice into the crumb. Families ate it for breakfast, dessert, and snacks throughout the week. The secret was chopping the apples very finely and using enough cinnamon to balance the sweetness. Mothers learned by chopping apples while their mothers mixed batter. By the 1990s, people preferred cakes that looked prettier and less rustic, and this apple-packed version disappeared from church tables. Special birthday celebrations in the 1960s called for burnt sugar cake, the most impressive dessert in grandmother's repertoire. The recipe required advanced planning because the burnt sugar syrup had to be made first. Grandmothers heated white sugar in a cast iron skillet over medium heat without stirring, letting it melt and turn deep amber, almost mahogany. When it reached the right color, they carefully added hot water, which caused violent bubbling and steam. The mixture was stirred until smooth, creating a dark, bittersweet caramel syrup that cooled completely before use. The cake itself was a classic yellow cake. Butter creamed with sugar, eggs added one at a time, flour mixed with baking powder and salt, alternated with milk. The burnt sugar syrup was added to the batter, turning it pale tan and infusing it with deep caramel flavor. The batter was divided between 2 or 3 layer pans and baked at 350 Fahrenheit for 25–30 minutes. The frosting also used burnt sugar syrup, butter beaten with powdered sugar, and enough syrup to make it spreadable and deeply flavored. The finished cake had a sophisticated, complex sweetness, not just sugary, but caramelized and slightly bitter, almost like toffee. Making the burnt sugar required nerve. Taking it too far made it bitter. Stopping too soon meant weak flavor. Mothers learned by watching their mothers swirl the melting sugar and judge the exact moment to add water. By the 1980s, caramel flavor came from bottles, and this from-scratch technique vanished completely. School bake sales in the 1960s always sold out of Tandy cake, a Pennsylvania Dutch specialty that became a family favorite across America. The cake was unusual, a thin vanilla sponge cake spread with peanut butter, then covered completely in chocolate. Grandmothers beat eggs and sugar until thick and pale yellow almost tripled in volume. Flour, baking powder, salt, hot milk, and vanilla were folded in gently to maintain the airiness. The thin batter was spread into a greased jelly roll pan, a large, shallow sheet pan, and baked at 350 Fahrenheit for just 12–15 minutes until lightly golden. While still warm, the cake was spread with creamy peanut butter. Grandmothers used a generous layer, almost as thick as the cake itself. The peanut butter softened from the warm cake and spread easily. The whole thing cooled completely, then was topped with melted chocolate. Grandmothers melted chocolate chips or chocolate bars with a little shortening or butter to make it smooth and shiny. Then poured it over the peanut butter layer and spread it evenly to the edges. Once the chocolate hardened, the cake was cut into small squares. Each bite had 3 distinct layers: tender cake, creamy peanut butter, and crisp chocolate. The cake was portable, stayed fresh for days, and tasted like homemade peanut butter cups. The key was spreading the peanut butter while the cake was still warm. Mothers learned by melting chocolate while their mothers spread peanut butter. By the 1990s, the Tandy cake brand sold factory-made versions, and homemade disappeared. Holiday celebrations in the 1960s featured Japanese fruitcake, a southern specialty with absolutely no connection to Japan. The name's origin remains a mystery, but the cake became a beloved tradition across the South. Grandmothers baked this as a 4-layer cake, 2 plain white layers and 2 spiced layers, stacked alternately. The white layers were simple vanilla cake: butter, sugar, eggs, flour, baking powder, milk, and vanilla. The spice layers used the same base but added cinnamon, allspice, cloves, and sometimes raisins or chopped nuts. All 4 layers baked in round pans at 350 for about 25 minutes. The real magic was the filling, a cooked mixture of fresh lemon juice, orange juice, grated citrus zest, crushed pineapple, sugar, and shredded coconut, thickened with a little cornstarch or flour, and cooked until translucent and jam-like. Some grandmothers added chopped pecans to the filling for extra texture. The layers were stacked with generous amounts of the fruit filling between each one, alternating white and spice layers. The outside was left unfrosted, showing off the striped layers, or covered with a thin layer of the fruit filling. The cake needed to sit overnight in the refrigerator so the filling could soak into the layers and the flavors could meld. Slicing revealed beautiful contrasting layers: pale vanilla, dark spice, bright citrus filling. The combination of tender cake, warm spices, and tangy fruit filling was unlike any other cake. Making the filling required constant stirring to prevent scorching. Mothers learned by stirring the filling while their mothers assembled layers. By the 1990s, this elaborate cake disappeared, too time-consuming for modern bakers, and daughters never tasted this uniquely Southern creation while their mothers assembled layers. By the 1990s, this elaborate cake disappeared, too time-consuming for modern bakers, and daughters never tasted this uniquely Southern creation. 20 cakes disappeared from grandmothers' kitchens. 10 more vanished without a trace. Every single recipe was baked in the 1960s. Every single recipe was forgotten by 2000. Daughters never learned. Recipe cards were lost. The baking stopped. The tradition died with the last grandmother who remembered. Wedding receptions in the 1960s across Kentucky and Tennessee always featured blackberry jam cake, a dark, moist spice cake that became synonymous with celebration. This wasn't a simple cake. It was a labor of love that required time, patience, and skill. Grandmothers started by creaming butter and sugar until light and fluffy, then added eggs one at a time, beating well after each addition. The secret ingredient was an entire jar of seedless blackberry jam stirred directly into the batter, giving the cake its distinctive deep purple-brown color and subtle fruity sweetness. Flour was mixed with baking soda, salt, cinnamon, allspice, nutmeg, and cloves. The spices had to be fresh, not the dusty jars that sat in cabinets for years. Buttermilk was added alternately with the flour mixture, creating a thick, fragrant batter. Chopped pecans and sometimes raisins were folded in last. The batter was divided between 3 or 4 round-layer pans and baked at 350 Fahrenheit for 25–30 minutes until the layers sprang back when touched. While the layers cooled, grandmothers made caramel icing, the traditional frosting for this cake. Real caramel icing wasn't simple buttercream. It was cooked on the stovetop. Sugar was melted in a heavy saucepan until it turned deep amber. Then butter and cream were carefully added, causing the mixture to bubble violently. The caramel was cooked to softball stage, then beaten as it cooled until it reached spreading consistency. This required perfect timing. Too soon and it was runny, too late and it became grainy and hard. The caramel icing was spread between the layers and all over the outside of the cake, creating a glossy, golden coating. The finished cake was tall, impressive, and incredibly rich. Each slice revealed dark, spiced layers with pockets of jam throughout, covered in sweet caramel frosting. The cake tasted even better the next day after the flavors had time to meld together. Families served this at weddings, anniversaries, Christmas dinners, and special birthdays. It was too precious for everyday eating. The technique of making caramel icing separated experienced bakers from beginners. Mothers learned by watching their mothers, judged the exact moment the caramel reached softball stage, and understanding how long to beat it as it cooled. By the 1990s, cream cheese frosting replaced traditional caramel icing because it was easier and more reliable. Store-bought jams replaced homemade blackberry preserves. Daughters never learned the careful technique of cooking sugar to caramel, beating it to the right consistency, and spreading it quickly before it hardened. The heirloom cake that once marked every important family milestone disappeared from Southern tables. Christmas Eve gatherings in the 1960s throughout Alabama and Georgia centered around Lane cake, an extravagant white layer cake with a boozy fruit and nut filling. The cake was named after Emma Rylander Lane, who created it in the 1890s, but it remained a beloved tradition through the 1960s. Grandmothers made this cake only for the most special occasions because it required expensive ingredients and considerable skill. The cake layers were classic white cake made with egg whites only, no yolks. Butter and sugar were creamed until fluffy. Then flour mixed with baking powder and salt was added alternately with milk. Stiffly beaten egg whites were folded in last, creating an incredibly light, tender crumb. The batter was divided between 3 round pans and baked at 350 Fahrenheit for about 20 minutes until barely golden. The real work began with the filling. Grandmothers saved the egg yolks from the cake and used them to make a rich custard filling. The yolks were beaten with sugar, then cooked in a double boiler with butter, stirring constantly until thickened. Off the heat, they stirred in chopped pecans, shredded coconut, chopped raisins, and chopped candied cherries. The traditional recipe called for bourbon or brandy, sometimes as much as half a cup, stirred into the warm filling. Once the filling cooled to room temperature, it was spread generously between the 3 cake layers. The outside of the cake was frosted with 7-minute frosting, a fluffy, marshmallow-like frosting made by beating egg whites with hot sugar syrup until glossy peaks formed. The finished cake was stunning, pure white on the outside, with dark, jewel-toned filling visible between the layers when sliced. Each bite combined tender white cake, rich custard filling studded with fruits and nuts, and cloud-like frosting. The cake needed to sit for at least a day before serving so the filling could firm up and the flavors could develop. Some grandmothers made this weeks before Christmas and stored it in cake tins, where the bourbon kept it moist and preserved. Making Lane cake required mastering multiple techniques: beating egg whites to stiff peaks without overbeating, cooking custard without curdling, and making 7-minute frosting without deflating it. Mothers learned by separating eggs while their mothers made the custard, understanding that even a speck of yolk would prevent the whites from whipping properly. By the 1980s, Lane cake disappeared from most family tables. The recipe was too complicated, required too many steps, and took too much time for modern bakers. Daughters never learned to make custard filling or fold egg whites properly. The heirloom cake that once represented the pinnacle of Southern baking vanished completely. Dinner parties in the 1960s concluded with mahogany cake, the sophisticated predecessor to red velvet cake. This cake dated back to the 1800s, but remained popular through the 1960s among grandmothers who valued traditional recipes. Unlike modern red velvet with its shocking red color from bottles of food coloring, mahogany cake achieved its reddish-brown hue naturally from the chemical reaction between cocoa powder and buttermilk. Grandmothers creamed butter and sugar thoroughly, added eggs one at a time, then incorporated a small amount of cocoa powder, just enough to give subtle chocolate flavor and that characteristic mahogany tint. Flour, baking soda, and salt were added alternately with buttermilk, creating a smooth, rust-colored batter. The cake was traditionally baked in 2 or 3 round layers at 350 Fahrenheit for about 25 minutes. What distinguished mahogany cake from red velvet wasn't just the color, it was the frosting. Mahogany cake was frosted with ermine frosting, also called boiled milk frosting or flour frosting. This wasn't buttercream or cream cheese frosting. It was something entirely different. Grandmothers made it by cooking flour and milk together on the stovetop, stirring constantly until it formed a thick paste. This paste cooled completely, then was beaten with butter and sugar until it became light, fluffy, and almost white. The texture was similar to whipped cream but more stable, and the flavor was sweet but not cloying. The finished cake was elegant and restrained. The dark layers contrasted beautifully with the pure white frosting. Each bite was tender, subtly chocolate, with a hint of tang from the buttermilk. The frosting was light and creamy, melting on the tongue without the heavy richness of buttercream. Mahogany cake was considered more refined than its flashier cousin, red velvet, and appeared at the most elegant occasions: engagement parties, anniversary celebrations, and formal holiday dinners. Making ermine frosting required patience and technique. The flour and milk paste had to cook long enough to eliminate the raw flour taste, but not so long that it scorched. It had to cool completely before being beaten with butter, or the butter would melt and the frosting would separate. The beating process took several minutes. Grandmothers beat it until it looked like thick whipped cream, light and airy. Mothers learned by stirring the flour paste while their mothers prepared other components. By the 1970s, red velvet cake with cream cheese frosting completely overshadowed mahogany cake. The dramatic red color appealed to modern tastes, while mahogany's subtle brown seemed dull. Ermine frosting was replaced by quick cream cheese frosting. Daughters never learned to make flour frosting. The heirloom cake that represented elegance and restraint disappeared completely. Autumn harvest suppers in the 1960s always included boiled raisin cake, a Depression-era recipe that remained popular because it was economical, easy, and delicious. The cake's unusual name came from the first step, boiling raisins with water, sugar, and spices before incorporating them into the batter. Grandmothers combined raisins, water, sugar, butter, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg in a large saucepan and brought everything to a rolling boil. The mixture boiled for exactly 3 minutes, filling the kitchen with the warm aroma of spices and caramelizing sugar. The pan was removed from heat and left to cool completely. This step was crucial because adding hot liquid to flour would create lumps and a tough texture. While the raisin mixture cooled, grandmothers prepared the dry ingredients. The cake came out incredibly moist, dense with fruit and nuts, and deeply spiced. Some grandmothers served it plain with a dusting of powdered sugar. Others made a simple glaze with powdered sugar and milk. The cake improved with age, becoming moister and more flavorful after a day or two as the spices mellowed and the raisins released more moisture into the crumb. Families stored it in tins and ate slices for breakfast with coffee, dessert after dinner, and snacks throughout the day. The cake stayed fresh for over a week, thanks to the moisture from the boiled raisins. What made this recipe special was its simplicity and economy. No expensive ingredients, no complicated techniques, just boil, cool, mix, bake. Yet it produced a cake that tasted complex and special, like something that required far more effort. The recipe originated during the Depression, when ingredients were scarce and expensive items like butter and eggs were used sparingly. Boiling the raisins with sugar and spices created intense flavor without requiring vanilla extract, fresh spices, or other costly additions. The technique also meant the raisins distributed evenly throughout the batter, instead of sinking to the bottom. Mothers learned by watching their mothers boil the raisin mixture and understanding the importance of letting it cool completely before adding flour. By the 1980s, people associated raisins with old-fashioned baking and avoided recipes that featured them. Spice cakes fell out of favor as chocolate and vanilla became dominant flavors. Daughters never learned this economical technique. The heirloom cake that once stretched limited ingredients into something delicious disappeared from family baking completely. Church potluck suppers in the 1960s always featured someone's date nut cake, carried in a covered dish and sliced into generous squares. This humble cake packed incredible flavor and moisture, despite its simple ingredients and straightforward method. Grandmothers started by pouring boiling water over chopped dates, letting them soften and plump for about 15 minutes. Meanwhile, they creamed butter and sugar, added eggs and vanilla, then stirred in the softened dates along with their soaking liquid. Flour, baking soda, baking powder, salt, and cinnamon went in next, mixed just until combined. Chopped walnuts or pecans were folded in last. The batter was thick and chunky, barely holding together. It was spread into a greased 9x13 pan and baked at 350 Fahrenheit for 35–40 minutes until firm and golden. The cake came out dense, moist, and studded with sweet dates and crunchy nuts in every bite. Some grandmothers served it plain. Others made a simple brown sugar glaze or cream cheese frosting. The cake was naturally sweet from the dates, so it didn't need much additional sugar. What made this cake special was how the dates broke down during baking, creating pockets of intense sweetness throughout the crumb, while also keeping the cake incredibly moist. The cake stayed fresh for over a week when stored properly, actually improving in flavor and texture as it sat. Families ate it for breakfast, afternoon snacks, and dessert. The recipe was forgiving. It didn't require precise measurements or careful technique, making it perfect for beginning bakers. The dates had to be chopped fairly small and softened in boiling water. Skipping this step meant hard, chewy chunks instead of soft, sweet pockets. Using good quality, fresh dates made a noticeable difference. Old, dried-out dates wouldn't soften properly and tasted stale. Mothers learned by chopping dates while their mothers mixed batter, understanding that dates stuck to knives unless the blade was periodically dipped in hot water. By the 1990s, dates disappeared from most pantries. Considered old-fashioned and unappealing, modern taste preferred chocolate chips or other mix-ins to dried fruit. Grocery stores stopped carrying quality dates in bulk, selling only the hard, plastic package variety that nobody wanted to bake with. Daughters never learned how to soften dates properly, fold them into batter, or appreciate their natural sweetness. The heirloom cake that once appeared at every church gathering vanished from potluck tables, taking with it the knowledge of how to bake with dried fruit. Rehooked 25 cakes disappeared forever. 5 more followed into extinction. Grandmothers stopped baking. Recipe boxes were thrown in trash during estate cleanouts. Nobody saved the handwritten cards. Nobody asked for the recipes before it was too late. The teaching stopped. The tradition died. The last 5 cakes vanished completely. Anniversary celebrations in the 1960s featured Walnut Blitz Torte, an impressive German-American dessert that looked like it came from a fancy bakery. The name Blitz meant lightning in German, referring to how quickly the meringue layers baked and crisped. This wasn't a simple cake. It was a showstopper with multiple components that required skill and timing. Grandmother started by making a simple yellow cake batter: cream butter and sugar, egg yolks, flour, baking powder, milk, and vanilla. The batter was divided between 2 greased and floured round pans and spread thin across the bottom. Here's where it got interesting. The leftover egg whites were beaten with cream of tartar until foamy. Then sugar was gradually added while beating until stiff, glossy peaks formed. This meringue was spread over the raw cake batter in each pan, covering it completely. Chopped walnuts were sprinkled generously over the meringue. Then more sugar was dusted on top. Both pans went into a 350 Fahrenheit oven and baked for about 30 minutes. During baking, the cake layer baked normally while the meringue on top dried and crisped into a crunchy, sweet topping studded with toasted walnuts. Once cooled, grandmothers carefully removed the layers from the pans. The meringue was fragile and could crack easily. Between the 2 layers went a thick filling of sweetened whipped cream, sometimes mixed with crushed berries or fruit preserves. The finished torte was spectacular: crispy meringue and walnuts on top and bottom, tender cake layers, and soft whipped cream filling in the middle. Each bite offered multiple textures and flavors: crunchy, chewy, tender, creamy, nutty, sweet. The torte had to be assembled close to serving time because the whipped cream filling didn't hold for long periods. Grandmothers often baked the layers a day ahead, then filled and served the torte the day of the party. Making this required understanding meringue. Egg whites had to be beaten to exactly the right consistency, not underbeaten and foamy or overbeaten and grainy. The meringue had to be spread carefully over the raw batter without deflating it. Mothers learned by beating egg whites, while their mothers prepared the cake batter, understanding that even a trace of yolk or grease would prevent proper whipping. By the 1980s, desserts with multiple components fell out of favor. People wanted simple cakes that could be made ahead and stored, not delicate tortes that required last-minute assembly. The specific technique of baking meringue directly on top of raw cake batter was forgotten. Daughters never learned to make this impressive torte, and it disappeared from celebration tables completely. Summer gatherings in the 1960s across the Deep South featured fig cake, a regional specialty that used fresh figs when they were in season. This wasn't widely known outside fig-growing regions, making it a true local heirloom. Grandmothers who had fig trees in their yards made this cake in late summer when the trees produced more fruit than the family could eat fresh. They chopped fresh figs, usually the brown turkey or Celeste varieties, into small pieces, removing the tough stem ends. The chopped figs were mixed with sugar and a splash of lemon juice, then set aside to macerate and release their juices. Grandmothers creamed butter and sugar, added eggs one at a time, then incorporated buttermilk, vanilla, and the fig mixture along with all its accumulated juice. Flour, baking soda, salt, cinnamon, nutmeg, and allspice were stirred in last, creating a thick batter studded with purple-pink fig pieces. Chopped pecans were often added for crunch. The batter went into a greased tube pan or bun pan and baked at 300 Fahrenheit for about an hour until deeply golden and firm. The cake came out incredibly moist, almost jammy in texture, with intense fig flavor throughout. Some grandmothers glazed it with a simple powdered sugar glaze. Others served it plain. The cake was best eaten within a few days, while the figs were still soft and jammy. What made this cake special was its connection to place and season. It could only be made when fresh figs were available, and only in regions where fig trees grew. The cake tasted like summer in the South. capturing the brief fig season in a dessert that could be shared and enjoyed. Fresh figs were crucial. Dried figs or fig preserves produced a completely different, less delicate result. The figs had to be ripe but not overripe, soft but still holding their shape. Mothers learned by picking figs with their mothers, understanding which ones were ready, and how to handle them without bruising. By the 1990s, fewer people had fig trees in their yards. Suburban developments replaced old homesteads, and fig trees were considered messy and old-fashioned. Fresh figs became expensive specialty items in grocery stores rather than free backyard abundance. Daughters never learned to make fig cake, and this regional heirloom disappeared except in the memories of those who grew up eating it. Appalachian mountain weddings in the 1960s throughout Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia centered around Appalachian stack cake, a traditional dessert with deep cultural significance. This wasn't a cake one person baked, it was a community effort. Each wedding guest brought a single cake layer, and the layers were stacked together at the reception to create a towering cake. The more layers, the more popular and well-loved the couple. Grandmothers made the layers using a firm, cookie-like dough rather than typical cake batter. They mixed flour, sugar, baking soda, salt, ginger, and sometimes sorghum or molasses into a stiff dough that was rolled out thin, about a quarter inch, and cut into circles using a plate or cake pan as a guide. These rounds were baked on flat pans at 375 Fahrenheit for about 10 minutes until lightly browned and firm. Between the layers went a filling made from dried apples that had been soaked overnight, then cooked with sugar and spices until they broke down into a thick jam-like paste. Some families used fresh apple butter instead. The layers and filling were stacked alternately, creating a tall cake with many thin layers. The assembled cake was wrapped and stored for several days before eating. This aging period was essential. During storage, moisture from the apple filling softened the firm cake layers until they became tender and cake-like, while the flavors melded together. A properly aged stack cake had layers that were moist and tender, almost indistinguishable from the apple filling between them. The finished cake was dense, moist, deeply spiced, and tasted intensely of apples and ginger. Cutting it revealed beautiful striped layers, pale tan cake and dark brown apple filling alternating throughout. The tradition of guests bringing layers meant the cake represented community support for the new couple. Making stack cake required understanding that the layers should be firm when baked. Soft layers would fall apart during assembly. The apple filling had to be thick and spreadable but not runny. The aging period couldn't be skipped. Fresh stack cake tasted dry and disappointing. Mothers learned by rolling out dough while their mothers prepared apple filling. By the 1980s, Appalachian stack cake disappeared from most weddings. Modern couples wanted white wedding cakes from bakeries, not rustic stacked layers from home kitchens. The tradition of community baking faded. Daughters never learned to make the firm cake layers or cook dried apples into filling. The heirloom cake that once symbolized community and celebration vanished from mountain culture. Sunday school gatherings in the 1960s sometimes featured scripture cake, also called Bible cake, a novelty recipe that doubled as a teaching tool. The recipe was written entirely in Bible verses. Each ingredient was referenced by book, chapter, and verse, requiring the baker to look up each one in the Bible to decode the recipe. Grandmothers used this to teach children about the Bible while also creating a delicious spice cake. For example, 1 cup Judges 5. 25 meant 1 cup butter. The verse mentions butter. 3 1 cups 1 Kings 4:22 meant flour. The verse mentions fine flour. And 2 cups Jeremiah 6. 20 meant sugar. The verse mentions sweet cane. The decoded recipe was actually a rich fruit and nut cake, similar to fruit cake. Grandmothers creamed butter and sugar, added eggs, then incorporated flour, baking powder, salt, and spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves. Raisins, chopped figs, chopped dates, and chopped almonds or walnuts were folded in along with a little milk. The thick, heavy batter was packed into a greased tube pan and baked at 300 Fahrenheit for about 90 minutes until firm and golden. The slow, low-temperature baking ensured even cooking without burning the fruit. The finished cake was dense, moist, and packed with fruit and nuts. It sliced cleanly and stayed fresh for weeks when wrapped properly. Families served it at church events, Sunday dinners, and holiday gatherings. The novelty of the biblical recipe made it memorable and meaningful, connecting food with faith and scripture study. Children learned Bible verses while helping decode the ingredients. Making scripture cake required owning a Bible and taking time to look up each reference. It couldn't be rushed. The recipe was as much about the process and teaching as the final product. Mothers learned by looking up verses while mothers mixed ingredients. By the 1980s, the tradition faded. Modern families wanted quick recipes, not ones that required biblical research. The connection between baking and scripture study was lost. Daughters never experienced decoding ingredients from Bible verses. The heirloom cake that once taught faith while creating delicious food disappeared from church gatherings completely. Afternoon tea parties in the 1960s among older grandmothers sometimes included seed cake, a British-inspired recipe that had been passed down through American families for generations. This wasn't sweet like modern cakes. It was lightly sweet and flavored primarily with caraway seeds, an acquired taste that modern palates found strange. Grandmothers creamed butter and sugar until fluffy, added eggs one at a time, then incorporated flour, baking powder, salt, milk, and a generous amount of caraway seeds, usually 2 to 3 tablespoons. Some versions added lemon zest for brightness. The batter was poured into a greased loaf pan or tube pan and baked at 350 Fahrenheit for about 50 minutes, until golden and firm. The cake came out tender and fine-crumbed with the distinctive licorice-like flavor of caraway throughout. It was served sliced thin, buttered, and eaten with tea or coffee. The cake wasn't meant to be overly sweet. It was more like a sweet bread than a dessert cake. Grandmothers who grew up in British households or had British ancestry maintained this tradition through the 1960s, serving it to friends who appreciated its unique flavor. The caraway seeds gave the cake an unusual taste, slightly anise-like, herbal, and aromatic. People either loved it or hated it. There was no middle ground. Those who grew up eating it found it comforting and nostalgic. Those encountering it for the first time often found it too strange. The cake represented old-world baking traditions brought to America and maintained by families who valued their heritage. Making seed cake required good quality, fresh caraway seeds. Old seeds tasted dusty and bitter rather than aromatic. The seeds had to be distributed evenly throughout the batter. Mothers learned by measuring caraway seeds while their mothers creamed butter, understanding that too many seeds made the cake overpowering. By the 1970s, caraway seeds disappeared from most spice racks, except for rye bread baking. The flavor fell completely out of favor as tastes shifted toward chocolate, vanilla, and fruit flavors. Younger generations found caraway's distinctive taste unpleasant and old-fashioned. Daughters never developed a taste for it, and certainly never learned to bake with it. The heirloom cake that once connected families to their British roots vanished from American tables, taking with it an entire flavor profile that modern bakers never experience. Outro 30 heirloom cakes vanished within a single generation. Each one was baked by grandmothers who learned from their mothers, written on index cards stained with butter and vanilla, tucked inside wooden recipe boxes that sat on kitchen counters for decades. These weren't just desserts. They were family identity, passed down through 3 generations of women teaching silently in warm kitchens on Sunday afternoons. Then the chain broke. Daughters stopped watching. Mothers stopped teaching. Grandmothers passed away in the 1990s and 2000s, taking with them the measurements and techniques that existed only in memory. Recipe cards were tossed during estate cleanouts. The handwriting faded and illegible. Cake pans were donated to thrift stores, and tube pans sold for $2 at yard sales. If your grandmother baked a burnt sugar cake from scratch, you tasted something that will never exist again. If you remember eating lane cake at family reunions, you witnessed a tradition that died in silence. Comment below which cake your grandmother baked best, and share this video with anyone who grew up in the 1960s, 80s before these recipes disappear completely from living memory.